My name is Dale Mercer. I'm 51 years old. I live in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I spent the last 23 years of my life building something from nothing, literally. I started as an electrician's apprentice at 18 in an industrial warehouse on the west side of town, hauling heavy cable on my back and learning to read wiring diagrams before I ever learned to read a contract. My supervisor back then was a man named Roy Tatum, 62 years old, hands that looked like they'd been carved out of oak. First day on the job, he handed me a pair of lineman's pliers and said, "An electrician who respects the current never gets burned. One who thinks he already knows everything gets burned on the first job." I never forgot that. I carried it into everything I did. By 32, I had my own company, Mercer Electrical and Installations, 14 employees, and commercial contracts across 3 counties. It wasn't luck. It was years of quiet work, up before everyone else, last one to leave, solving problems the customer didn't even know they had. My company wasn't the biggest in the region. It was the one people called when the deadline had already passed, and the job had to be done right the first time. Every Friday morning, before I got to the office, I'd stop at a small diner on the corner of Vine Avenue called Pete's. I'd order 2 biscuits and a black coffee, sit at the counter, and spend about 15 minutes watching the neighborhood wake up. The owner, a man named Pete, who'd watched me grow up on that street, never charged me for the coffee. I always left double the tip without saying a word. That's how it worked between us. No need to spell it out. Sandra and I had been married 18 years. She was Sandra Whitmore when I met her. Dark hair, direct way about her, the kind of woman who smiled rarely but meant it every time she did. She worked in human resources at a mid-size company here in Knoxville, and she had this rare ability to walk into a room full of conflict and walk out with everything settled. I admired that about her. I admired the certainty she carried. The first few years we had a ritual on Sunday mornings. She'd make scrambled eggs with cheese, I'd make the juice, and we'd sit on the back porch without saying much. It wasn't dullness. It was the kind of quiet that only exists between 2 people who don't need to fill the silence. We had 2 kids, Kyle, who's 21 now, and Brooke, who's 16. The company grew. Sandra got promoted several times over the years, eventually becoming Director of Human Resources at a multinational with offices in Atlanta. With the promotion came the travel. She was gone Monday through Thursday every week. I stayed in Knoxville and kept everything running, the kids, the contracts, the job sites. I should have noticed the crack when Kyle started saying things about my company in a way I hadn't taught him. Phrases that weren't his, that had the rhythm of someone who'd heard them somewhere else and repeated them without fully understanding the weight they carried. "You just wire buildings, Dad." He was 13 the first time he said it, on an afternoon when I'd gotten home late and missed one of his school events. I answered calmly, without making a scene, and let it go. But the phrase stayed with me. They always do. Before I go on, if you've been through something like this, or if you know a man who's ever been reduced by his own family to what he provides instead of who he is, subscribe to the channel. These stories aren't about bitterness. They're not about revenge. They're about what happens when a man finally stops trying to prove something to the wrong people. Hit the like button, leave a comment. Now come back with me to an October night in Knoxville. It was a Thursday in October. The air in Knoxville that time of year carries the smell of fallen leaves and wood smoke, that dry, cool smell that comes off the hills when the wind shifts, the kind you can't really describe to someone who didn't grow up here. Sandra had come back from Atlanta early that day, which she almost never did. I was at the office when she texted saying she was picking Kyle up from campus and that we'd be having dinner at her mother's house. Short message, no explanation for why we were having an unplanned dinner at the mother-in-law's on a Thursday. That was Sandra's style. Statements, not invitations. I didn't love going to Sandra's mother's house. Not because Ruth was a bad person. She was kind, actually, in that particular way that welcomes you into the family while making sure you never forget you married into it. But it was a space where I never fully fit. The walls were covered in family photos, Ruth and her late husband Gerald, the kids, the grandkids, vacations, and I appeared in 2 or 3 of them, small, usually in a suit at some holiday event, with that expression of someone who's present but doesn't quite belong to the frame. I arrived at 7. The table was already set. Ruth had made a pot roast, the kind she made on the days she wanted everyone to leave satisfied. Kyle was sitting at the head of the table, my usual seat. I didn't say anything and sat down beside him, between him and Brooke. The conversation started fine. Ruth asked about the company, the new contract, the crew. I answered calmly. Kyle spent a couple of minutes on his phone until Sandra said his name once and he put it down. Then Kyle brought up wanting a new truck. His, a 2-year-old Ford Ranger I'd helped him buy when he started college, was embarrassing. Ruth agreed that a young man of 21, with Kyle's future ahead of him, deserved a vehicle that matched where he was headed. Sandra didn't say anything, but she didn't disagree either. I said, in the same tone I use when I'm explaining a bid to a new client, the Ranger was 2 years old and there was nothing wrong with it. The company's finances were being restructured after a major equipment purchase, and a new truck would have to wait at least 6 months. 6 months. Kyle repeated it slowly, staring at the table, like he was processing something absurd. Then he looked at his mother for just a second I didn't miss, and then, with the look of someone who'd finally said what he'd been holding on to, he turned to face me. Dad, you're only good for paying the bills. Everybody knows that. Ruth drew in a sharp breath. Brooke stopped chewing. Sandra kept her fork on her plate, eyes on her food. The table went quiet for 3 seconds that felt much longer than that. Then Sandra's brother-in-law, Craig, a 45-year-old man who ran a landscaping company and held the highest opinion of himself of anyone I've ever met, let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a cough. The kind of laugh that's not committed, that can be denied later as a misunderstanding. But it was a laugh, and that was all it needed to crack the room open. 2 more smiles at the table. Kyle leaned back in his chair like someone who'd just won something. I looked down at my plate. The pot roast was good. The gravy was exactly right. I thought briefly that Ruth had always known how to make that. Then I picked up the phone that was sitting next to my glass, opened the banking app, and with 6 taps, sent a transfer. I set the phone back face down on the table and kept eating. The table stayed in that mood of someone who just made themselves feel bigger. 32 seconds later, I know because I counted, though I couldn't tell you why, Kyle's phone buzzed next to his plate. He looked at the screen. The smile stopped halfway through his expression. What was left was the face of someone receiving information they haven't processed yet. Not joy, not gratitude, not anger. Confusion. $43,700. The exact amount of Kyle's university tuition for the semester, a figure I would learn in the weeks that followed that Sandra had promised him she would pay with her own money, and which he had come to believe would never be paid because his father had refused to help. But I'm not going to get to that part yet. I need you to understand how I got to that table. I need to tell you about the 3 years before that night. Because what Kyle said didn't start at that dinner table. It was cultivated, patiently, methodically, by someone who understood very well how words shape a young person's reality over time. Sandra started to change after the promotion, not all at once. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, like a temperature that climbs 2 degrees a week and you only notice when you're already sweating through your shirt. The Monday through Thursday trips became Monday through Friday. The weekends that used to be ours became visits to her family in Atlanta. Sunday mornings on the back porch, lost the scrambled eggs, then the juice, then my chair. Gradually, I started eating alone during the week, and on the weekends when she was home, there was always something with her family that made it unlikely we'd have any time to ourselves. I worked. That's what I knew how to do, and what I had the responsibility to do. The company had grown, and 14 families depended indirectly on how I managed our contracts. So I worked, and when I got home the dinner was made, or there was a note on the microwave telling me what was left over. What I wasn't seeing, and only came to understand months later with the help of one specific person, was this. Sandra was building a narrative about me, not for strangers. for our own children. In front of Kyle and Brooke, she'd comment on my decisions in ways that seemed reasonable, even neutral, but that accumulated layer by layer over years. Your father decided not to take vacation again this year. That's just how he is. Your dad bought that expensive equipment without consulting anyone, but he knows more about those things than I do. Your dad couldn't make it to your game because of a meeting. You know how he is. There's always something more urgent. Each phrase, on its own, had a reasonable explanation. Together, across 3 years, they were building a character, a man who was functionally absent, who existed in terms of what he produced, whose worth was measured by what he paid. Not a father with an interior life, a provider with a spreadsheet. Kyle, the oldest, the one who spent the most time with her in Atlanta during the week, absorbed it like a sponge. He was exactly the right age for the narrative to take hold, old enough not to need bedtime stories anymore, but young enough to still let his mother define what it meant to be a man. And Sandra, with the human relations skill I had genuinely admired for years, the woman who walked into rooms full of conflict and walked out with everything organized, knew exactly how to plant an idea without it ever appearing that she was planting one. "You're only good for paying the bills" wasn't a 21-year-old's original thought. It was the concentrated distillation of 3 years of carefully constructed narrative, and it was said at that table with the ease of someone repeating something they believe is obvious, because to him, in that moment, it was. And then I found the second part of the story, the part that had nothing emotional about it. Editor, Maitre had a spreadsheet. It was a night in August. I was in the home office looking for the car insurance documents, a room Sandra used when she worked remotely, one that had been quietly reorganized over months without me noticing. The insurance wasn't in the folder where it should have been. While I was looking, my hand found an envelope I didn't recognize. It was at the back of a drawer under a folder of car maintenance receipts. Inside was a bank statement, an account in the name of Sandra Whitmore, not Sandra Mercer. Whitmore, her maiden name. The account had been opened 2 years and 7 months earlier. The balance was $118,000. I stood there holding that paper for 4 minutes. For anyone who knows me, that's 4 minutes longer than I've ever stood still for anything in my life. I'm not a man who hesitates in front of a problem. But this wasn't the kind of problem where moving fast was a virtue. It wasn't the amount that stopped me. It was the name. She had opened that account using her name from before we were married. There was no innocent explanation for that. A woman married 18 years who opens a bank account in her maiden name isn't being careless. She's being deliberate. I closed the envelope, put it back where I found it, and went to the kitchen. I made a pan of cornbread from scratch. Didn't eat it. Just made it, cleaned up, and went to bed. That night, lying in the dark with Sandra breathing quietly beside me, she'd come back from Atlanta early that specific day, which also wasn't a coincidence. I made a decision. I didn't decide what I was going to do. I decided I was going to understand the full picture before I did anything at all. Over the following weeks, I started paying attention in a way I never had before. Not paranoid, not anxious, clinical, methodical. The way I approach an electrical diagnostic on an old installation, you don't touch anything until you've mapped the full circuit. You check every connection point. You understand what's wired to what before you open any panel. What I found, slowly and carefully, was this. For 18 consecutive months, Sandra had been making monthly transfers from our joint account to her personal account, amounts carefully calibrated not to trigger any alarm on a statement that gets glanced at, between $800 and $1,200 a month. Added up, it was $21,000. Separate from the larger amount, I still didn't fully understand. I also found something more serious than the money. Sandra had let a property insurance policy lapse, one that covered equipment at my company. I didn't know because the policy came to her email. She'd taken over managing the paperwork years earlier when I was overwhelmed with a growth period at the company, and I'd never gone back to check. It's the kind of trust you place in a long marriage without realizing you're placing it. The policy had been lapsed for 11 months. If any equipment had been damaged, stolen, or destroyed in that period, and the electrical equipment I use in the field runs between $70,000 and $120,000, I would have had no coverage. and no one had told me. I ran the numbers, she'd said in a conversation about finances some months before, in the neutral tone she used for decisions already made. With the company at its current pace, we can cut some redundancies. I'd agreed without asking what the redundancies were. The hallway carpet had the mark of where a piece of furniture had stood for years. She'd quietly reorganized the home office without mentioning it, and I hadn't noticed that the insurance folder had moved at least a year earlier. She'd moved the documents while I was working, and then the scope of the damage became clearer, colder, more calculated than I'd imagined. Through conversations with someone I'm about to introduce you to, I built a timeline. Sandra had started the systematic transfers 18 months prior. She'd opened the account in her maiden name 2 years and 7 months prior, which meant the planning had started before the transfers. She'd let the company's insurance lapse 11 months prior, during a stretch when I was running 2 major contracts simultaneously and working 12-hour days. And in that same period, she'd intensified what I now understood to be a sustained construction of narrative with the kids. Each piece, separately, looked circumstantial. Together, they had an architecture. That architecture had an intention. There was an accomplice in this, not in any criminal sense, but someone who knew and had been encouraging it. Craig, Sandra's brother-in-law, the one who'd laughed first at that dinner table. He and Sandra had grown close over the last 2 years, closer than seemed natural for a brother-in-law and sister-in-law, and I'd noticed without naming what I was noticing. Weeks after that dinner, when all the pieces were on the table, I'd come to understand that Craig had been acting as a kind of informal advisor on the separation process, encouraging Sandra to secure her assets before making any move. He himself had gone through a bad divorce 4 years earlier and come out at a disadvantage. He didn't want his sister to repeat the story. Neither of them had accounted for the man I actually was. And the floor really shifted when Brooke, my 16-year-old daughter, who had her mother's eyes and her father's patience, showed me, without understanding the weight of what she was doing, a text message that Kyle had sent her one September afternoon. She got in the car when I picked her up from school, stayed quiet for a minute. Then she handed me her phone. "Mom says Dad refuses to pay for my college," the message from Kyle read, "that she's going to have to handle it herself because of him." I sat looking at the screen for a few seconds with the car parked in the school lot. "Is that true, Dad?" Brooke asked, in that teenage voice that doesn't yet fully understand that some questions don't have a simple answer. "No," I said. She looked at me. "That's not true," I said again, handed her phone back, and pulled out of the parking lot. I drove to Pete's diner. It wasn't Friday. It was Wednesday. Pete was wiping down the counter. I ordered a coffee, sat at a stool, and stayed there for about 20 minutes, looking out at the street without thinking about anything in particular. Then the pieces fell completely into place. The narrative wasn't just about diminishing me in front of the kids. It was about creating a version of me that retroactively justified what she had already decided to do. An absent husband, emotionally checked out, who even refused to help pay for his son's education. When the time came, and she had already decided the time was coming, there would be witnesses, including her own children. It was elegant. It had taken years, and it had almost worked. Walt Deacon has lived across the street from me for 12 years. He's 68, a retired civil engineer who spent 30 years in commercial real estate here in Knoxville and knows every title office, every deed clause, and every family law attorney in this city by name. We had the kind of friendship that exists between neighbors who respect each other without needing anything from each other. We knew each other's lives, but we didn't ask. When my mother died 4 years ago, Walt showed up at my door with a pot of chili and said only, "If you need anything." He didn't come in, didn't want to. He left the food and went home. I understood that as the most genuine gesture a person can make, presence without any expectation of return. One morning in September, 2 weeks after I'd found the bank statement, I was out on the curb washing the truck. Walt came out to get his newspaper, the way he does every morning. He looked at me for a moment with that expression of someone who notices something without needing to ask. "You sleeping?" he asked. "I'm sleeping," I said. "Doesn't look like it." We stood there for about 10 seconds. The sprinkler on his front lawn ticked back and forth. "I have a technical question about real estate," I said. He folded the newspaper under his arm without hesitating. "Come on in." We sat at his kitchen table. He made coffee in the same drip machine he's used for 20 years. No question about whether I wanted any. 2 mugs, dark wood table with years of wear in it. I explained the situation, not all of it, just the part about the documentation and the account in her maiden name, and asked what it meant legally in terms of marital assets. Walt stayed quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. Account opened in maiden name during the marriage, with regular transfers from the joint account. He didn't say it like a question. He said it like someone organizing information. Have you looked at the wills? Which wills? Yours, hers, and her mother's. En wine, war, my morgers. I hadn't thought of that. Ruth has been a widow for 8 years, Walt said. She owns property here in Knoxville, and at least a couple of places out in Maryville. I know because I did an appraisal on one of them years back. Do you know who's in her will? I didn't. Dale. He set his mug on the table with that precision of someone who measures every gesture. Before you do anything, you need to understand what she's protecting, not how much. What? That question stayed with me for days. The what, not the how much. The difference mattered. 2 days later, I called Frank Holloway, an attorney I knew from work since we'd done the electrical installation in his office 3 years earlier. I asked for a confidential conversation. He met me on a Friday afternoon after everyone in his office had gone home in a conference room that smelled like old paper and cold coffee. I laid out the situation. Frank listened without interrupting, pen in hand, but not writing. At the end, he asked 3 questions. Was the company solely in my name? Yes. Was the house in both our names? Yes. Did the joint account require my signature for withdrawals? No, Sandra had power of attorney for individual transactions. Frank stayed quiet for a moment. When did you give her power of attorney? 8 years ago, when I had knee surgery and needed someone to sign checks for a couple of weeks. And you never revoked it? Not a question. A statement. There's something I never told anyone during that period. Not Walt, not Frank, not anyone in my family. I'm telling it now because it's the center of everything that happened after. 3 months before I found Sandra's bank statement, I received a letter from a law firm in Louisville, Kentucky. The letter, printed on cream-colored paper with a modest letterhead, said that a man named Thomas Ray Mercer had died at 76 with no known heirs, and that DNA tracing conducted at the request of the estate had indicated I was likely his unregistered biological son. Thomas Mercer had been an industrial engineer in Louisville for 40 years, never formally married, no registered children, and he had left behind an estate that included real property, accounts, and a stake in an industrial consulting firm. My mother had gotten pregnant by him during a brief relationship in the early 70s, before she married my father, the man I knew as my dad, who died when I was 17. She had built the story that my biological father had died young. She died without ever telling me the truth. I hired Frank to verify the legitimacy of the letter before I mentioned it to anyone. It took 6 weeks of document analysis and a DNA test conducted through an independent lab in Nashville. The letter was real. Thomas Ray Mercer was my biological father, and the estate was real. $438,000 in real property, accounts, and equity interest. Assessed by Gary Pruitt, a wealth accountant Frank recommended, 60 years old, an office downtown, and the look of a man who genuinely has seen everything, at $499,000 in total, including the value of the consulting firm's stake. I was processing 2 stories at the same time, a wife planning an advantageous divorce and a mother who had kept a secret for 50 years about who I was. Sandra knew none of this. No one did. While she was moving money from our joint account to protect her assets, I had quietly inherited a figure 4 times larger. And while I was processing that inheritance, I was also sitting with questions that had no answers. Who was Thomas Mercer? What kind of man was he? Why had he left everything to a son he'd never met? There are things you receive without being able to thank anyone or question anything. Frank had explained that as long as the assets remained formalized under the estate and were not transferred to my personal ownership during the marriage, they would fall outside the scope of marital property division in Tennessee, provided the process was handled correctly. It was a matter of timing and precise documentation. I hadn't rushed the process. I'd left it moving at the natural pace of the Louisville law firm, which handled estates of that size with the measured slowness of inheritance bureaucracy. Walt knew about the existence of the inheritance, not the amount, just the fact. I'd mentioned it in general terms in one of our conversations. It was Walt who said one afternoon, sitting on his back porch while Knoxville made its usual noise behind us, "What a person hides tells you more about what they're planning than anything they show you." I went home and thought about that for days. Then I started organizing. The plan wasn't complicated. It was patient. 4 steps, each one needing to happen in the right order, like a complex electrical installation where you don't connect the main panel until every branch circuit has been verified. First step, Frank filed a formal revocation of Sandra's power of attorney for individual transactions on the joint account, done in 15 business days through a formal bank notification and a notarized document. Sandra received her copy of the notification in the mail on a Tuesday. That day, she came back from Atlanta earlier than expected and stayed in her home office for 2 hours. She didn't say anything to me. I didn't say anything to her. Second step, Gary Pruitt analyzed 18 months of joint account statements and prepared a technical report documenting the pattern of the transfers, amounts, frequency, progression. It was legal documentation, not an accusation. But it was a document that in the context of a divorce dispute would completely change the floor of any negotiation. The file was called Marital Transaction Analysis, Mercer, period 2022-2024. 132 pages of tables and charts that no attorney Sandra could hire would be able to challenge without significant effort. Third step, I drove to Louisville on a Tuesday morning and signed the estate acceptance documents at the estate attorney's office, alone. The assets were formalized into an account in my name only, opened 2 days earlier specifically for that purpose. $438,000, plus the firm stake transferred by assignment of interest. Fourth step, I looked up the exact amount of Kyle's university tuition for the semester. The university system showed $43,700. I held that number with the same precision I hold a cable measurement. There was a moment, 3 days before the dinner, when Sandra came home earlier than expected and found me at the kitchen table with documents spread out. She stopped in the doorway, looked at the papers, and asked what they were. "Job documentation," I said without looking up. She stood there for 2 seconds. Then she went upstairs to shower. I gathered the documents slowly, folded each one along the right crease, put them back in the folder. I didn't let anything show. That was the hardest part of those weeks. Not the anger, not the grief, but the calculated indifference. Looking at her while she poured coffee or walked through the living room and not feeling the pull to say, I know exactly what you're doing. In more, some, and one more, not because I was angry, because I had decided that the moment she found out would be when I chose, not when she stumbled onto something by accident. The real test came a few days before the dinner. Sandra called from Atlanta one afternoon with that voice she used for decisions already made. "I've been thinking about listing the house. The market's good right now. We could split the proceeds, and I'd just stay in Atlanta more permanently." 3 seconds of silence on my end. "We can talk about that this weekend," I said. "Dale, this weekend," I repeated, with the quiet of someone closing a meeting that's already over, and hung up. I called Frank immediately. He said, "She's accelerating." Her attorney probably told her the favorable documentation window is closing. I asked what I should do. He said, "Nothing. Let her believe the weekend conversation is going to happen." The weekend conversation never happened. The dinner at Ruth's house happened first, and you already know what happened at dinner. I left Ruth's house, got in the truck, and drove for 40 minutes with no particular destination. Knoxville at night has those wide streets with old oaks overhead and the hills going dark in the distance, a city that feels like it's been sitting in its own history for a long time. I passed by Market Square twice without stopping. Sandra's phone called 3 times. I didn't answer. On the 4th call, I turned the phone off. I got home, put water on to boil, made chamomile tea, what I always make when I need something simple and warm without the risk of lying awake on caffeine. Sat on the back porch in the dark with the mug in my hands. The October air in Knoxville has that particular smell, fallen leaves and distant wood smoke and something damp coming off the river. It's a smell that doesn't exist anywhere else. I sat there maybe an hour, maybe more. I didn't feel triumphant. That wasn't what I expected to feel. It was something else, closer to the relief of someone who's finally set down a weight that was never theirs to carry and is only now realizing how heavy it was. That particular exhaustion you feel after something ends, not while it's still happening. The next morning, Frank called at 8:15. Sandra had contacted the law firm she'd retained at 8 on the dot. She'd had her own attorney for at least 3 months, which confirmed what I already knew about the planning. The request was for a mediation meeting for uncontested dissolution of marriage. She wants uncontested, Frank said, because uncontested is faster and she still thinks she's negotiating from an equal position. Exactly. Schedule the meeting. The meeting was a Wednesday at 2 in the afternoon in a neutral office downtown. Me, Frank, Sandra, her attorney, a man named Leonard Cross, gray suit, brown leather briefcase, competent looking without being cruel. Cross presented Sandra's proposal. I'd keep the company, she'd keep the house and the balances in her personal accounts. He didn't mention Ruth's advance on the inheritance, didn't mention the maiden name account. The proposal treated all of it as money she'd saved independently over the years. Frank set Gary's report on the table. Cross looked at the report for 30 seconds. Then he asked for a recess. The recess lasted 47 minutes. When they came back, the proposal had changed. The full negotiation ran 6 weeks. Some meetings I attended, others Frank handled alone. I kept working the whole time. Closed the contract on the warehouse complex out on the interstate. Renewed the company's insurance, this time in the company's name, with copies to my email and Frank's. Kept picking Brooke up from school on Tuesdays and Thursdays. In the end, the agreement established division of the residential property at current market value with settlement within 90 days. Return of the $21,000 in irregular transfers to the joint account for proportional division. Shared custody of Brooke with a stable and balanced parenting schedule. The Louisville inheritance remained exclusively mine, outside the scope of marital property. Sandra had never known of its existence, and therefore it was never a subject of discussion. Sandra signed the documents on a Friday afternoon without looking at me. I signed without saying a word. I walked out of Frank's office at 6 in the evening. The air was cold for Knoxville, maybe 50 degrees, which here feels colder than it sounds. I drove straight to Pete's diner. Pete was locking up. He saw me come in, poured a cup from whatever was left in the pot, it was already lukewarm, and set it on the counter. I left double the tip without saying anything. He didn't ask how I was doing. The consequences for Sandra weren't dramatic. They were logical, the kind that don't require anyone else but a person's own decisions. The promise she'd made to Kyle about paying his tuition with her own money collapsed when it became clear that her available money had been reduced by the settlement. Kyle heard it from her directly in a conversation I wasn't present for and didn't need to be. What I know is that after that conversation, he didn't speak to his mother for 3 weeks, and that when he called me one evening in December, it was to say he was trying to work some things out and it was going to take time. That's all right, I said, and that was everything that needed to be said. Craig, the brother-in-law, who'd laughed first at that table, stepped back quickly once the details of the settlement started circulating in the family. Not because he suddenly developed principles, because he'd bet on the wrong side and he knew it. That kind of man always recalculates once the result is clear. Ruth called me 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized. She said she'd updated her will. I told her she didn't have to tell me that. She said, "I know, but I want you to know that I know what happened." We stayed quiet for a moment. "Thank you, Ruth," I said. She hung up. I never found out exactly what she'd changed. I didn't need to. Today I live in an apartment in the Bearden neighborhood, old part of town. Brick buildings, tall oaks on the sidewalk, the kind of place Knoxville still has if you know where to look. It's smaller than the house. It has a balcony that faces the street with a view of a dogwood tree that goes completely white with flowers in April. Early in the morning, before the traffic starts, I hear the birds and sometimes a red cardinal in the branches. I'm up at 6, make coffee, read for an hour before I open the laptop. Friday mornings I stop at Pete's, same as always. Pete's still there. Kyle called in December, like I said. He called again in February, this time to tell me he'd changed his major from business to electrical engineering. I don't know if that was a coincidence. I didn't ask. He told me with that tone of someone waiting for a reaction, and when I didn't react with surprise, just said, "That's good, you've got a real aptitude for it." He went quiet for a second and then talked for 20 minutes about what he'd been studying. Brooke stays with me on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and every other weekend. Sunday mornings, she still wants scrambled eggs with cheese. I make the juice. She scrolls her phone while the eggs cook. We sit without talking much. In March, she said without looking at me, "You were really calm that night." Which night? Grandma Ruth's. When Kyle said that, I was. Why? I looked at the glass of juice in my hand for about 3 seconds. Because shouting doesn't solve anything when you already know what you're going to do, I said. She thought about that for a moment, then went back to her phone. That's enough. Walt called one out in February and invited me over for a cookout, just the two of us and his wife Carol, who makes a smoked brisket you won't find in any restaurant. I went on a Friday evening with a 6-pack of beer and nothing else to offer. Partway through dinner, while Carol was getting dessert, Walt said, "You stayed quiet for a long time through all that." I did, I agreed. Was it worth it? I picked up my drink. She planned for years. I waited for months. I think I know how to do the math. 1,000 more, in more, one more and more. Walt let out a short laugh, the kind that isn't about something being funny, but about something being recognized. Always did, he said. Carol came back with a peach cobbler that smelled like something worth staying for, and the conversation moved on. But that phrase stayed with me on the drive home. I always did. And that was the one thing Sandra had never been able to take from me. Even after years of trying to convince me through strategic silence and careful narrative that I was less than I was. I need to tell you something about silence because that's the heart of this story, and probably the heart of the story of a lot of men listening to this right now. For years I believed a quiet man was a man with nothing to say. That not reacting was a sign of weakness, that the man who didn't shout back didn't have anything worth saying. The culture around me reinforced that my whole life. Friends, conversations at the bar, movies, well-meaning advice. You're gonna let her do that to you? You're just gonna stay quiet? But what I learned, not from a book, not from a podcast, but from those weeks in October when I knew what I knew and chose not to show it, is that silence isn't absence. Silence can be the strongest position available in certain moments because the other side can't prepare for something they don't see coming. Sandra was smart. Her plan was good. She had calculated my income, my company, our joint assets, the timing, the narrative with the kids. She had calculated everything about the man she thought I was. What she hadn't calculated was what I was carrying and never showed. And here's what I want you to take into your own life. Whatever situation you're facing, the people who underestimate you rarely do it out of stupidity. They do it because you let them. Because for years you were readable, predictable, always responding when provoked, always explaining when questioned, always proving when doubted. They learned your map. Becoming unreadable isn't hiding who you are or pretending to be someone different. It's stopping the habit of answering every challenge that doesn't deserve an answer. It's stopping the need to prove yourself to people who've already decided what they think of you. It's understanding that the only proof that changes a real situation is the kind that arrives as facts, not words spoken in a moment of anger. A man who blows up rarely changes the terrain. A man who acts methodically, without announcing it, without needing anyone to see it, that man changes the ground under the feet of whoever bet against him. I'm not saying it's easy. That night on the back porch, with the smell of leaves and the tea going cold in my hands, was one of the hardest nights of my life. Not because I was angry, the anger had passed back in August, but because I was seeing, with complete clarity, a situation that couldn't be undone, and clarity is heavier than anger. Anger passes, clarity stays, and you have to carry it productively, or it will stop you cold. The choice I made between blowing up and acting wasn't heroic. It was practical. It was the only choice that actually solved the problem. Blowing up would have given Sandra exactly what she needed, the image of an unstable husband that she'd spent 3 years constructing. Staying quiet and acting was the opposite of that. Have you ever stayed quiet when you wanted to shout, not out of fear, but because you understood that the right moment hadn't come yet? Have you ever held back a response because you knew the right answer wasn't ready? And if you haven't, what stopped you? Leave that in the comments. I want to read it. If this story landed somewhere in you, if it touched something you recognize from your own life or from someone you know, hit the like button. It's not an empty gesture. It helps these stories reach the people who need them. If you know a man going through a moment where he feels like he's been reduced to what he produces, what he pays, what he provides, and he's forgotten what he is beyond that, share this video with him. Sometimes the most important thing a man needs to hear isn't that everything's going to be okay. It's that staying quiet when everything is screaming at you to explode can be the most strategic and most dignified move there is. Subscribe to the channel. Every week, there's a new story, and they all carry the same theme underneath: what a man discovers about himself when he loses what he thought defined him and finds what was always there before any of it. In the comments, tell me, have you ever been reduced to a function, provider, husband, bill payer, the man who covers it, by someone who was supposed to see you as a person? And what did you do with that? Until next time.